The briefing room at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado smelled like stale coffee and decades of testosterone. 23 men sat in folding chairs, their BDUs still damp from the morning ocean run, their faces carrying that particular brand of exhaustion that comes from hell-week survivors who thought they'd seen everything. At the front of the room stood Lieutenant Commander Reina Vasquez, 5'4" in boots, 118 pounds of compact muscle and controlled fury, her seal trident gleaming against desert tan fabric that had seen more combat than most of the instructors combined. The men weren't listening. They were calculating, measuring, dismissing. One of them, a bulky Georgian named Kowalski, leaned toward his buddy and whispered something that made 3 others snicker. Reina caught it, filed it away, said nothing. She'd learned years ago that words meant nothing in rooms like this. Only results mattered. Only blood earned respect. The training scenario was simple on paper. Close quarters battle evolution. 8-on-8 force-on-force using simunition rounds that hurt like hell and left welts the size of quarters. Blue team versus gold team. The catch that made Kowalski grin like he'd won the lottery was that Reina would be solo, designated as a high-value target that both teams needed to capture or eliminate, while she attempted to extract to the rally point 400 meters through a modified urban warfare facility that the Navy had spent $6 million making deliberately cruel. The men saw it as entertainment. The kind of evolution that gets whispered about in dive bars afterward, where some uppity female officer got what was coming to her, where the natural order reasserted itself in ways that paperwork and politicians couldn't prevent. What they didn't know, what the classified folder in Commander Ashford's safe could have told them but wouldn't, was that Reina Vasquez had earned her call sign, Sunshine, not from personality but from a night in Helmand Province where she'd walked point through a grape field at dawn, stepped on a pressure plate, and smiled at her team leader while holding the trigger down for 40 minutes until EOD could get there, her legs cramping, her bladder failing, her mind going to places that most people only visit in nightmares, all while humming "Here Comes the Sun" to keep herself from screaming. The compound was a maze of shipping containers converted into rooms, tight corners, kill zones designed by men who understood that urban warfare was where heroes went to die badly. Reina stood at the insertion point, checking her modified M4 with the kind of casual precision that came from 10,000 repetitions. Kowalski and 3 others from Gold Team took the north entrance, weapons raised, already talking about how they'd corral her into the central courtyard where Blue Team would be waiting. The plan was sound. 8 operators with better positioning, better numbers, better everything except the one variable they couldn't quantify, which was what happens when you corner something that learned to survive by becoming meaner than the things trying to kill it. Reina moved through the first corridor like water finding cracks, her footfalls silent on concrete, her breathing controlled through her nose, her eyes tracking corners and shadows with the kind of pattern recognition that separates operators from casualties. She heard them before she saw them. 2 Blue Team members clearing rooms with textbook precision but peacetime caution, the kind of clearing that works in training and gets you killed in Ramadi. She let them pass her hide position behind a false wall panel, counted to 3, stepped out, and put 2 simunition rounds in each of their backs before they could turn. The shots echoed through the container complex. Now everyone knew the game had started, and that Sunshine was hunting. Gold Team adjusted, tightening their formation, Kowalski on point with his weapon scanning high while his buddy covered low. They moved through a choke point between 2 containers, textbook again, everything by doctrine, everything except for the flashbang that Reina had wedged into the drainage grate that detonated when Kowalski's boot hit the pressure plate she'd rigged with 550 cord and a door hinge. The sim grenade wouldn't kill anyone, but the magnesium flare of light and the crack of sound turned their formation into chaos for 3 seconds, which was 2 seconds more than Reina needed to drop from the container roof where she'd climbed using drainage pipes and a prayer, landing behind them, and systematically putting rounds into Kowalski and two others before the fourth man could spin and return fire. His rounds went wide. Hers didn't. 6 down, 10 to go, and somewhere in the maze of metal and shadows, the remaining operators were realizing that the prey had fangs. Blue Team's leader, a Master Chief named Doherty who'd done tour in places the Navy officially denied existed, made the call over the radio to consolidate, reform, and approach this like an actual combat operation instead of a turkey shoot. Reyna was already moving to her next position, her mind calculating angles and probabilities the way some people did crossword puzzles, her body operating on muscle memory while her consciousness stayed 3 steps ahead, visualizing the terrain, predicting movement patterns, understanding that 16 men had trained together for months while she'd trained alone for years, which meant they'd move like a pack and she'd move like a ghost. The central courtyard was the objective, a 40-meter clearing between containers with minimal cover and maximum exposure. Blue Team set up overwatch positions on elevated platforms, 3 men with good angles and better patience. Gold Team's survivors spread to flank positions, trying to create a kill box that would force Reyna into the open. It was a good plan. It would have worked against most operators. Reyna went up instead of through, using the container's corrugated walls to climb to the roof, staying low, moving during moments when ambient noise covered her movement. She could hear them coordinating over radio, their voices tight with the kind of focus that comes when you realize you're in over your head but training won't let you quit. She waited on the roof's edge, watching the overwatch positions, counting breaths, her finger resting on the trigger guard, her mind clear as mountain water. When the remaining Gold Team members made their push toward the courtyard, the Blue Team Overwatch shifted their attention, weapons tracking the movement, concentration narrowing to the ground-level threats. Reyna moved then, dropping from the container roof onto the platform behind the nearest Overwatch position, her landing silent as conscience. The operator never heard her coming. 2 rounds center mass. He dropped. The second Overwatch position spun at the sound, weapon raising, eyes widening as he saw sunshine emerging from an angle that shouldn't have been possible. His rounds went high from surprise. Hers didn't. The third Overwatch dove for cover, getting on radio to call the contact, but Reyna was already moving, flowing across the platform, using his own cover against him, coming around the corner low while he expected high, and putting rounds into his vest before he could readjust. 13 down, 3 to go, and the remaining operators weren't laughing anymore. They were scared, which made them dangerous in a different way. Doherty made the decision to abandon the extraction point and hunt instead, knowing that pride mattered less than ending this before it became the story that defined their careers. They moved as a 3-man team, weapons interlocked, covering each other's movement with the kind of practiced efficiency that comes from doing this for real in places where mistakes earned flag-draped coffins. Reyna was waiting at the extraction point, weapon trained on the approach corridor, her body positioned behind a reinforced barrier that gave her cover and concealment. She'd gambled that they'd come for her instead of defending the objective, and she'd been right. Sometimes knowing your enemy meant knowing their pride. They entered the corridor carefully, Doherty on point, his weapon sweeping the angles with professional paranoia. They almost made it. The tripwire Reyna had rigged using her rigger's belt, and a Sim Claymore caught the second man's ankle. The blast lit up the corridor, taking him out of the fight. Doherty and the third operator dove for cover, returning fire, their rounds sparking off the barrier where Reyna had been positioned 3 seconds earlier, because she'd moved the instant the Claymore detonated, flowing to a flanking position that gave her an angle on their cover. The final exchange lasted 6 seconds, both sides firing controlled bursts, rounds impacting walls and barriers, the sound deafening in the enclosed space, cordite smell thick as regret. Reyna took a simunition round to the shoulder that would leave a bruise like a baseball, but her rounds found Doherty's vest, and then the third operator's helmet as he tried to reposition. The silence that followed was absolute. 16 operators down, all of them veterans, all of them qualified, all of them underestimating the woman who'd learned in Helmand that survival wasn't about being the biggest or the strongest. It was about being willing to go places in your head that other people couldn't follow. The after-action debrief was quieter than the pre-brief. The men sat in the same chairs, but the energy had changed from mockery to something harder to name. Kowalski had a welt on his ribs that would hurt for a week. Doherty had a split lip from diving for cover. All of them had the look of men who'd learned a lesson they hadn't expected to need. Commander Ashford stood at the front now, his arms crossed, his face showing nothing. He waited until the silence became uncomfortable, then spoke in the kind of voice that made junior officers check their posture. He didn't recap the evolution. Everyone knew what happened. Instead, he told them about Helmand, about the grape field, about 40 minutes that turned into legend among people who kept secrets for living. He told them why they called her Sunshine, and it wasn't because she smiled. The men listened, and in listening, something shifted. Respect in combat units isn't given freely. It's earned through shared suffering, through proving that you won't quit when quitting makes sense, through demonstrating that you're willing to carry your weight and someone else's if necessary. Reyna had done that in Helmand. She'd done it again today, and the men understood that they'd been part of her proof, willing or not. After the debrief ended, Kowalski approached her in the corridor, his face red, his pride clearly wounded but his eyes showing something that looked like honesty. He said he was sorry, and he meant it, and Reyna nodded because she didn't need his apology but recognized the courage it took to offer it. They'd never be friends, but they might be brothers, which in the teams was a more important thing. Word spread the way it always does in tight communities. Within a week, every SEAL on the West Coast knew about the evolution at Coronado, about Sunshine taking down 16 operators in a force-on-force that should have been impossible. The story grew in the telling, details embellished, facts stretched, but the core remained true. Lieutenant Commander Reyna Vasquez was not someone you underestimated. She became the operator that senior leaders pointed to when junior officers questioned integration policies, when politicians asked if women belonged in special operations, when anyone suggested that standards should be lowered for inclusion. She hadn't needed lowered standards. She'd exceeded them repeatedly in ways that made the men around her better through competition and example. 3 months later, Reyna was in Syria, attached to a joint task force hunting high-value targets in the remains of Raqqa. The city was a moonscape of rubble and unexploded ordnance, buildings reduced to skeletal frames, streets cratered by airstrikes and VBIED attacks. Her team was 8 operators, including Kowalski and Doherty, tracking a cell leader who'd been coordinating attacks against coalition forces. The mission was supposed to be simple: locate, fix, finish. Intelligence said the target was in a compound on the eastern edge of the city, minimal security, low threat. Intelligence was wrong, which happened often enough that operators planned for it. They inserted via ground vehicle, 3 MRAPs rolling through streets that smelled like death and cordite, their turret gunners scanning rooftops, everyone's nerves tight as piano wire. The compound was larger than the satellite imagery suggested, with multiple structures and good sightlines for defense. Reyna felt it in her gut before the shooting started, that particular tingle that came from pattern recognition and survivor's instinct. She called halt over the radio, suggested they abort and reassess. The task force commander, an army colonel who'd flown in from Baghdad that morning, overruled her. They pushed forward. That's when the world turned into fire. The ambush was textbook asymmetric warfare. RPGs from elevated positions, machine gun fire from concealed bunkers, the street ahead blocked with rubble that forced the MRAPs into a kill box that had been prepared with malicious patience. The lead vehicle took an RPG to the engine block, disabling it, its crew bailing out into cover while rounds sparked off armor. The second vehicle tried to reverse and hit an IED that had been buried in the street, the blast lifting the 18-ton vehicle like a toy, flipping it onto its side. Reyna's vehicle was third in line. Suddenly the point element, with 2 disabled vehicles ahead and an unknown number of enemy fighters with superior positioning and prepared defenses. The colonel was screaming over the radio for air support, for QRF, for someone to fix this clusterfuck that his hubris had created. Reyna took command, not through rank but through certainty. Her voice on the radio was calm as Sunday morning, issuing orders that made sense, directing fire, coordinating movement. She dismounted with Kowalski and 2 others, using the MRAP as cover while they assessed the situation. The enemy positions were good, mutually supporting, designed to keep them pinned until reinforcements arrived or they ran out of ammunition. The conventional response was to hunker down, wait for air support, accept casualties as the cost of tactical rigidity. Reyna saw a different option, risky as cancer, but possible if executed with the kind of precision that left no margin for error. She radioed her plan to Doherty, who was in the overturned MRAP with 3 casualties and dwindling cover. He listened, calculated odds, agreed because the alternative was worse. Reyna and Kowalski moved through the rubble, using destroyed buildings for concealment, flanking the enemy positions while the rest of the team provided suppressing fire. The urban terrain was treacherous. Walls that looked stable were hollow facades. Floors that appeared solid opened into basements full of debris and bodies. They moved slowly, checking corners, avoiding skylining, their weapons tracking every shadow. The first enemy position was a bunker made from sandbags and rebar, 2 fighters with a PKM machine gun pouring fire into the disabled MRAPs. Reyna approached from an angle they hadn't fortified, using a collapsed wall as cover, getting within grenade range. She signaled Kowalski, counted down on her fingers, threw the frag with a motion she'd practiced 10,000 times. The explosion silenced the machine gun. They moved before the dust settled. The second position was harder. 3 fighters in an elevated room with good sightlines and reinforced walls. Conventional assault would get someone killed. Reyna noticed the building's structural damage, walls cracked from previous bombardment, support beams exposed. She directed Kowalski to provide covering fire while she climbed the exterior using rubble as handholds, going up the outside of the building where defenders would be watching approaches, not exits. It took 3 minutes that felt like hours, her muscles burning, her hands scraped raw, but she reached the room level and came through a window that had been blown out by some previous violence. The fighters never expected assault from above. The engagement was over in seconds, brutal and close, the kind of fighting that happened at arm's length with no room for hesitation. 4 more positions remained, each one a tactical problem that needed solving before the enemy reinforcements arrived or air support turned the whole block into rubble with everyone in it. Reyna and Kowalski moved like dancers, each understanding the other's movement without speaking, covering angles, coordinating fire, trusting each other the way you only trust people who have bled beside you. They cleared the positions one by one, taking wounds, taking risks, taking the fight to an enemy that had counted on Americans doing the predictable thing. By the time Apache gunships arrived overhead, rotors thundering, 30 cannons ready to sanitize grid squares, Reyna had broken the ambush from inside, given the team enough breathing room to consolidate casualties and establish security. The colonel tried to take credit in his after-action report. Doherty made sure the actual story reached people who mattered. The medal ceremony happened 6 months later at a secure facility in Virginia, where cameras weren't allowed and half the attendees had cover identities. Reyna stood at attention in dress blues while a 3-star admiral read citations that couldn't include most of the relevant details. The Navy Cross they pinned to her chest was the nation's 2nd highest decoration for valor, and everyone in that room knew she'd earned it in ways the public would never hear about. Her parents were there, her mother crying, her father trying not to, both of them still struggling to reconcile the daughter they'd raised in Albuquerque with the warrior she'd become. After the ceremony, other operators approached her, men who'd spent careers in the shadows, who understood what she'd done and what it cost. They didn't say much. They didn't need to. A nod, A handshake, a word of respect between professionals who knew that valor wasn't about speeches or medals. It was about the moment when everything goes wrong, and you keep moving forward anyway. Reina stayed in the teams for another 4 years, deploying to places that would remain classified for decades, training the next generation of operators who would face threats she could only imagine. She became the instructor that junior officers hoped to impress, the operator that planners wanted on complex missions, the legend that recruits heard about in whispers. Some of the stories were true. Some were embellished beyond recognition. She didn't correct either version because the truth was less important than the lesson. That competence matters more than demographics. That courage comes in all sizes. That underestimating someone because they don't fit your mental picture is the fastest way to lose. When she finally retired, there was no parade, no public acknowledgement, just a quiet ceremony in a team room where men she'd served with presented her with a plaque that showed her call sign, her deployments, and a single line: Sunshine. She smiled in the dark so we could find the light. She kept it in her home office, along with the patches and coins and memories that civilians would never understand. She took a job teaching tactics at a private military academy, passing along lessons written in scar tissue and muscle memory. Her students were mostly men, some of them coming in with attitudes that she recognized from Coronado, from 100 briefing rooms where people had looked at her and seen something less than what she was. She didn't argue with them. She didn't lecture them about respect or equality or any of the abstractions that politicians loved and operators distrusted. She just taught them, pushed them, challenged them to exceed standards that most of them didn't think they could meet. She made them better by demanding better, and in time they understood that sunshine wasn't a call sign you earned through personality. It was a reminder that even in the darkest places, even when everything seems impossible, there are people who smile because they've learned that fear is just another thing you can choose to ignore. The first time one of her students called her sunshine to her face, meaning it as respect instead of mockery, she felt something shift in her chest. It wasn't pride exactly. It was satisfaction, the kind that comes from knowing you've changed the equation, however slightly, for the people who come after. Years passed as they do. Reina watched her students graduate, watched them deploy, watched some of them come home in boxes that their families weren't allowed to open. She attended funerals in civilian clothes, standing in the back, unknown to the families but recognized by the operators who understood that she was there because she'd earned the right to witness their grief. She helped some of them transition back to civilian life, the ones who struggled with the weight of what they'd seen and done, who needed someone who understood that some wounds don't heal, they just become part of who you are. She married eventually, another veteran who understood that some nights she'd wake up remembering Helmand, that some sounds would always make her hands move toward weapons that weren't there, that the person you become in combat is someone you carry forever. The call came on a Tuesday morning, 17 years after Coronado, 13 years after Syria. Commander Ashford, retired now, his voice older but still carrying that authority that made junior officers check their posture. He told her about a program, classified, recruiting former operators for specialized training missions. The kind of work that happened in countries America officially wasn't operating in, teaching indigenous forces to fight wars that would never make the news. He said they needed instructors who understood asymmetric warfare, who could train soldiers to survive against superior forces, who knew what it meant to be underestimated and use it as a weapon. He said they needed her, specifically, because the recruits were female operators from allied nations, women who faced the same skepticism she'd faced, who needed to see someone who'd survived the doubt and emerged stronger. She said yes before he finished explaining the pay structure, because some calls you answer not for money, but because saying no would mean admitting you'd lost something essential. The training facility was in Poland, close enough to support NATO operations, far enough to maintain deniability. 23 women from 14 countries, most of them already combat veterans in their own right, all of them fighting against institutional resistance that made American integration look progressive. Raina recognized the look in their eyes, that particular combination of determination and fury that came from having to prove yourself repeatedly to people who'd never question a man with half your qualifications. She didn't try to be their friend. She tried to be their forge, the place where raw ability got refined into something unbreakable. She ran them through evolutions that made Coronado look gentle, pushed them into scenarios where failure meant learning and success meant harder challenges, taught them that respect in combat units isn't gifted, it's extracted with competence and courage. One of the women, a Ukrainian named Oksana who'd been fighting Russians since she was 19, asked her during a break why she pushed them so hard, whether it was some internalized need to prove women could match men in cruelty. Raina looked at her, saw the genuine question beneath the challenge, decided to answer honestly. She said that she pushed them hard because the world would push harder, that enemies wouldn't care about their politics or their struggles, that the only thing that mattered in the moment when everything turns to chaos was whether you trained hard enough to keep yourself and your team alive. She said that she wasn't trying to prove they could match men. She was trying to prove they could exceed anyone, male or female, who hadn't paid the same price in sweat and determination. Oksana nodded, understanding passing between them, and went back to training with the kind of intensity that meant the lesson had landed. The graduation ceremony was nothing like Raina's medal ceremony. No admirals, no speeches, just 23 women receiving certificates that meant nothing to civilians and everything to the community that understood what they'd accomplished. Ashford was there, older now, his shoulders carrying the weight of 40 years in service. He pulled Raina aside after the ceremony, told her that the program was expanding, that they wanted her to run the next cycle, and the one after that. He said she'd become the standard, the proof that all the arguments about integration and standards and capability were settled questions for anyone paying attention. He said her legacy wasn't just the operations she'd completed or the medals she'd earned. It was the women in that room who'd learned from her that being underestimated was an advantage if you had the competence to weaponize it. Raina thought about legacies as she flew home, watching Europe disappear beneath clouds, her body carrying scars that civilian doctors would never understand, her mind holding memories that most people couldn't bear. She thought about the girl she'd been in Albuquerque, before the Navy, before Helmand, before she learned that she could smile while holding down a pressure plate because the alternative was watching her team die. She thought about the operator she'd become, forged in grape fields and Syrian rubble, tested by men who thought her gender made her weak, proven in ways that left no room for doubt. She thought about the women she'd trained, the ones who'd carry forward the lesson that competence trumps demographics, that courage isn't distributed according to chromosomes, that the only thing that matters when the shooting starts is whether you've prepared yourself to do what's necessary. 20 years after Coronado, the briefing room where 16 men had underestimated her got renovated, turned into a training space with updated equipment and ergonomic chairs. But the wall still carried plaques showing notable evolutions, training scenarios that became legend, lessons written in simulated casualties and real humility. The one from that Tuesday morning was there, brass plate engraved with simple facts. 16 operators, 1 target, evolution completed with 0 casualties to the target and total team elimination. Underneath, someone had added a quote, unofficial and probably against regulations, but nobody took it down. They called her Sunshine because she smiled in the dark. We call her Legend because she taught us that underestimating competence for any reason is the fastest way to lose. New operators training at Coronado would stand in front of that plaque, would hear the story from instructors who'd heard it from instructors, the details getting polished with repetition until it was hard to separate fact from mythology. Some of them would dismiss it as exaggeration, would convince themselves that 16-1 was impossible, that the story had grown in the telling. They'd be wrong, but they'd learn, eventually, the way all operators learn, through failure that teaches humility, through challenge that demands excellence, through the gradual understanding that the person standing in front of you matters more than the assumptions you brought with you. Reina never returned to Coronado. She didn't need to. Her presence was there in the stories, in the standards, in the quiet understanding among operators who'd learned that respect isn't about agreeing with everyone or lowering bars to make inclusion easier. It was about holding the line on competence, about demanding excellence from everyone regardless of demographics, about understanding that the teams became stronger not by excluding people, but by refusing to accept mediocrity from anyone. She'd proven that a woman could not only survive SEAL training but excel in it, not by changing standards but by exceeding them, not by asking for accommodation, but by demonstrating that she needed none. Her students from Poland deployed to conflicts that would remain classified, operated in shadows that civilians never saw, earned their own reputations through competence and courage. Some of them died, because that's the cost of doing this work, and Reina attended their funerals when she could, standing in the back, unknown to their families, but recognized by the operators who understood that she'd given these women the tools to succeed in a profession that killed people for making mistakes. The ones who survived wrote her letters sometimes, telling her about operations they couldn't detail, about moments when the training had saved their lives, about the satisfaction of proving wrong every person who'd ever doubted them. She kept the letters in a box in her office, next to the plaque and the medals and the memories. On quiet mornings, when the past felt closer than the present, she'd think about that day in Coronado, about Kowalski's snicker, and the men who'd seen her as entertainment, about the choice she'd made to let results speak instead of words. She'd think about Syria, about Helmand, about all the places where she'd been tested and found sufficient. She'd think about the women she'd trained, about the legacy that extended beyond her own accomplishments. And she'd smile, not because those memories were pleasant, but because they'd taught her something essential. That being underestimated was only a disadvantage if you believed it, that every person who doubted her had given her energy to prove them wrong, that the smile she'd learned to wear in darkness had become a weapon more powerful than anything she'd carried. The sky outside her window was the same blue it had been over Helmand, over Syria, over Poland. The same sky that covered operators moving through darkness in countries civilians couldn't name, women and men doing work that would never make headlines, earning respect the only way it could be earned. One operation at a time, one challenge at a time, one moment of keeping your head when everyone else was losing theirs. Reina Vasquez, Lieutenant Commander retired, call sign Sunshine, had learned in that grape field that survival was a choice you made continuously, that smiling in the face of death was an act of defiance more powerful than violence. She taught that lesson to operators who needed it, to women who faced skepticism she recognized, to anyone willing to understand that competence and courage weren't limited by biology or demographics or anyone's prejudice. They'd mocked her once, 23 men in a briefing room at Coronado, seeing a woman and assuming weakness, seeing her size and missing her strength, seeing her gender and forgetting her resume. She taught them different, not through speeches or arguments but through 500 meters of urban combat where she'd systematically dismantled 16 operators using skill, strategy, and the kind of relentless competence that turned skeptics into believers. That was her legacy, written not in words but in the understanding that passed between operators when they told the story. That respect had to be earned, but once earned it was absolute. That Sunshine was more than a call sign. It was a reminder that even in the darkest places, some people smile because they've learned that fear is just another enemy that can be defeated through preparation and will. The sun rose over Virginia, painting the sky in colors that reminded her of dawns in a dozen countries, light pushing back darkness the way it always had, the way it always would. Reina finished her coffee, felt the scars on her shoulder where simunition rounds had left their mark, remembered the men who'd underestimated her and the grace she'd shown in proving them wrong. She had work to do, students to train, lessons to pass forward. The fight wasn't over. It never was. But she'd learned in Helmand, proven in Syria, and taught in Poland that you didn't have to be the biggest or the strongest to win. You just had to be willing to smile in the darkness and keep moving forward while everyone else was figuring out whether to be afraid. That was the lesson. That was the legacy. That was why they called her Sunshine, and why her name would be spoken with respect long after she was gone. A reminder to every operator who came after that competence could never be dismissed, that courage knew no demographic, and that underestimating someone for any reason except their proven ability was the fastest way to learn a lesson you'd never forget.